Well, good evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight as we continue in our study of Bible families. Purpose of our study is we've been looking through different families in the Bible and trying to pull out ideas for how the Bible designs for us the family to behave and work by looking at the examples that are given to us. Just one second, I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I just have to fix there. I got it fixed now. And so we're going to be looking tonight at a family I think we're all very familiar with, and that is the family of Jacob. Probably one of the more tumultuous and problematic families, important families, of course, that we want to take a few minutes to consider tonight. I hope you were able to do our reading in the reading that we had for you, Genesis 29, 30, 31, and 37. As I said before, these are probably chapters that everybody's very familiar with for the circumstances that are going on here. And the things that we want to talk about tonight in regards to Jacob's family, and you might remember Jacob, of course, is the same person as Israel. Sometimes that's a little confusing. If you're not real familiar with the stories in Genesis, you might not remember that Jacob is renamed Israel and that his descendants are, of course, the Israelites. And what we want to consider tonight is how it is that Jacob's family's turmoil, a lot of that was created by marital instability and some of the problems that come out of that. I also want to talk a little bit about Laban and how greed and covetousness can do damage to a family as well. And that's going to be an important thing we'll consider. As we talk about Jacob's sons, the 12 sons that he would have, we're going to talk a little bit about how families fight. Of course, this one is pretty dramatic, but sometimes that's the relationships that family have, a great deal of turmoil. And we want to talk a little bit about where that might have been rooted and the results of that, of course, and understand a little better about a lot of the circumstances that brought those things about. And finally, probably one of the best parts of the story of Jacob's family, and that is Jacob's son Joseph, and how it was that he was able to forgive his family despite the fact that they had done some pretty terrible things. All of the subjects that we're looking at tonight, I think, are very relevant and very practical things for us to consider. All things that I think we can take them and make some kind of application to them in our lives. So I want to go back and I want to remind you again the story of Jacob. And as I said, maybe for some of us, if we were in kids especially, we went through classes where these events were very much the center of our study. But for some of us, we didn't start coming to Bible studies and such, so we're much older, and we didn't get to have that immersion in the Old Testament as many of us did. So if you're not familiar with the story, I'll remind you that Jacob is the younger of Isaac's sons, Abraham's grandsons. And he is, we talked about last time, the son who got the promise, the inheritance promise that was so important because it also was the lineage promise that God had made to Abraham that Christ was going to come through. So it's the most important promise that there is. And that promise goes to Jacob. And Jacob leaves home. His brother wants to kill him, if you remember. He leaves home and he goes back to the family of his mother, Rebekah. And his mother's family lives in the country of Aram, or Aram. And Aram is where the Aramaic language comes from that they speak often in the New Testament. And he goes back there and he meets Laban, Rebekah's brother, and falls in love with his daughter. That is the younger daughter of the two daughters he has, Rachel. The older daughter is Leah, and we're all very familiar with how it was that when he made the arrangement to work for Laban in order that he might marry Rachel, that instead they swap out on the wedding night, Leah, and then Jacob has to work for 7 more years. I think, like I said, we're all very familiar with that, but let me kind of make a point to you so you can kind of get a better sense of the family here. Leah is the wife who, and I don't know if this is really fair to say, but I feel as though the scripture puts more weight on her spirituality. She's the one that prays more. She's the one that calls upon the Lord more. Rachel's the one who steals the idols in another event in the Old Testament. So oftentimes it's almost as though Leah is the more spiritual one. And as I said, that might be an inference that's not a necessary inference, but but there does seem to be some difference between the two sisters. We see that Leah is also the one that's blessed with the most children. 6 of the 12 sons and the only daughter that Jacob would have are going to come through Leah. Now, we know Rachel would have 2 children, and we also know that each of those women would then supply one of their maids that sometimes are called wives. Other times they're described more like concubines, kind of a difficult thing sometimes for us to exactly put our finger on. But between these people are 13 children, 12 sons. And it's going to be kind of important to understand that, because a lot of the relationship this family is going to have is the relationship dynamic that's created because there are different sons. So, for example, whenever Dinah's story comes along and we read about how she was violated by the Shulamite and how those things happened, we also find it's going to be her full brothers, Simeon and Levi, that are the ones that go forth and take vengeance about that. So you might get a sense of the brothers that were the most offended. You might get a sense then of how this family behaved in a way that gave a problematic sense to what we're going to pursue and what we're going to see momentarily. Where does the problem in Jacob's family seem to arise? Well, we talked about this last week with Isaac and with Rebekah and how they each had their own favorites of their children. Do you remember that? How we talked about how they would have favorites among their children and how they preferred one or the other. We talked about how dangerous that is. We said it's not wrong when there's a preference over spiritual characteristics, but we did say that the favoritism that's condemned in places like James chapter 2 in the first few verses there, that we saw how that favoritism based on worldly things, and that was the problem with Isaac and maybe with Rebekah and their preference for their children. It was worldly, but that preference and its manifestation created great strife. Well, we understand that the same thing happened here, that in Jacob's home there was a great deal of jealousy and envy, that first and foremost Jacob would prefer one wife over the other, and that whole circumstance itself is very unusual, but we would understand that here Jacob has a preference in these women, and of course I don't know what to say as far as I really couldn't say, well, you should treat all your wives equally. That obviously is going to be problematic. In fact, one of the questions I want to ask you about this is to make the point for you to consider that this isn't something that's appropriate today. But I also would suggest to you that a lot of the problems are also these uncontrolled emotions of jealousy and these outbursts of wrath that seem to be prevalent among these siblings and among this family. And so that's going to be a big part of this. In fact, I would suggest to you one of the interesting things about Jacob is at the end of his life, Jacob makes the declaration that unpleasant have been the years of my life. I don't know about you, but I find that very interesting that towards the end of his life, this is Genesis chapter 47, verse 9, that Jacob would say, I haven't had a great life. And I would have to say, Jacob, that a lot of that was because the family circumstances that you had weren't family circumstances that really behooved themselves towards success. And a big part of that originates itself with marriage. So I've got a couple of questions for you to think about here tonight. I want you to take a look at these and think about the ones we're considering. First of all, I'd like you to consider today, is it lawful to have more than one husband or wife? The term there is polygamy. And I want you to tell me why or why not. In other words, is it something, and by the way, I'm going to tell you right now that in the New Testament, you're not going to find a statement that says thou shalt only have one husband or one wife as far as in terms of polygamy goes, or where it says no longer can you marry multiple people. You're going to have to reach a necessary inference from some things to come up with the answer to this question. But is it lawful today to have multiple husbands or multiple wives? And of course, in the Bible, we really just see multiple wives as the thing that is carried out. But this is an important question. You need to be able to answer this for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons pertains to some of the teaching about marriage and divorce even. And so I'll give you kind of moments to think about that question. Now, in just a moment, the second question we're going to talk about how is it that when you marry somebody, you're also marrying their family? In other words, one of the important ideas here is that when when Jacob seeks to marry Rachel, he ends up attaching himself to Laban. And there's an important idea here that we want to understand. The idea of how it is that when you marry somebody, in a sense, you get a lot of other things with that. A lot of that family with that. And that's an important thing for us to consider. I want you to consider that here in just a moment. Some of the problems that came up because of Jacob's relationship with Laban, that is the father of the women that he would marry. Now, I've got a couple of answers already for this question, and let me kind of jump back for just a moment to consider this. Anthony gives us the following. Anthony says in Genesis chapter 2, God, when he created marriage, he created a marriage between man and wife, not man and wives. And that's a very specific statement that's made there in Genesis chapter 2, and it's an important one to consider, that whenever God creates marriage and whenever God authorized marriage, that what the Word of God tells us there is that in verse 23, verse 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So that's an interesting point, important point for us to consider of how it was that God created marriage, what marriage was supposed to look like from the very beginning. Now, I see we also have a comment here from Gregor, and Gregor makes the following comment. Gregor says, it's lawful of man in some places, not intended by God. And Matthew 19 is where I go. That's right. And I want you to go over, or I'll tell you what, I'll go over there and I'll consider that one. I'll put that one up for you to consider for just a second. Here is Jesus teaching about marriage, and he says in verse 5, quoting Genesis 2, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And Jesus makes it clear by saying, two shall become one flesh. This is the teaching. This is the teaching of what it is that they are supposed to be considering. That is to say, the teaching here in Matthew 19 is the teaching of Genesis 2. And this is Jesus's law of marriage, that this is what it is. Now, he does go on to certify in verses 7, 8, and 9 that Moses' law deviated from that. This is important, by the way. You need to understand this because this is important. There's sometimes where people think that maybe what Jesus was saying in Matthew 19 was just a restatement of the law of Moses. The law of Moses permitted a man to have more than one wife. There were actually legal precedents put in place of how a man who had more than one wife was to behave. Jesus is saying, and this is the only place we really go to that specifies that a man can only have one wife, that Jesus says his law is that two people, a man and a woman, become one flesh, and that's the creation of marriage. So it's kind of important, by the way, if somebody says, well, I don't think Matthew 19 applies today, then frankly, there really isn't a specific statement in the New Testament that outlaws polygamy. Now, there are points that are made about this. I see Lamar's goes to one of them in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2. And he points out that a bishop or an elder, this also is stated in Titus chapter 1, that an elder must be the husband of one wife. So there is this statement about polygamy, and at least the idea that for those that are in that position, that's their circumstance as well. It's also spoken of deacons too. So those are things that are important for us to understand. So Debbie says the same thing. Debbie, I missed you just a second ago. Debbie makes the point to say that elders are the husband of one wife, and that also becomes an example for us too. But fundamentally, when we want to understand why polygamy isn't permitted today, Matthew 19 is the statement about that. And it helps us to understand that if that is the statement, then the things that Jesus was saying there weren't the law of Moses, because the law of Moses permitted it, but this is the law of Christ, a different law that goes back to the original law of marriage. And that's an important thing for us to consider. Now, I told you I had another question for you to consider there after this one. I said I wanted you to consider the circumstance of Laban and Jacob. So let me ask you, and I don't know, this might be maybe a question that really can't be easily answered. It's not like a yes or no kind of thing, but in what ways do we accept the family of the person that we marry? And I want to be careful here because it doesn't mean that it's an entire acceptance, but But what kind of things are brought into that relationship? What kinds of things do we have to consider when we marry someone about their family and our relationship with them? And this is important. It's important because I think a lot of times people don't really think about this. When they think about marrying somebody, they just see the person they're going to marry and how marvelous they are. And they may not be thinking about all the family that in some ways comes with them. What kind of things, if you were advising somebody who's getting married, we got some young people that are listening in right now, and they're perhaps looking ahead to getting married, and one of the things we would want to implant in their mind is to think about how it is that that's something you need to consider very carefully. What kind of advice might you give to somebody about that and the family of the person? On a side note, I see Stephen James made a good comment. He says it's interesting that Jacob traveled to the same country that Abraham forbid Eliezer to take Isaac. Now, what's interesting about that is that is where Isaac's wife came from, but Isaac was not permitted to leave. And that's one of the interesting things about Isaac's sojourn that's a little different than Jacob's, is that Isaac was compelled to stay in the land, whereas Jacob wasn't. And Stephen, that is very interesting consideration about that. I wonder if it might be part of the reason for Jacob's misery as well, that his traveling out, and it could be. Certainly that's something that's a little bit different to consider there. So the question is, what ways do we have to accept family? Let me give you a couple of thoughts that I have here. One of the thoughts is whenever we are choosing a spouse, one of the things we have to consider is that we'll be under an obligation to take care of some of those people later. We talked about this before, right? Way back in our first family discussion, we talked about how there is an expectation and obligation, both in the law of Christ and even before the law of Christ, that we're to take care of family, to be our brother's keeper. If I were very interested in somebody, but their family had people that had special needs and cares, I need to put into my mind, I would need to think about the idea that it's going to be important for me to be able to take care of those people, because that's going to become part of my obligation. That's something that's going to be important for me to do. And some of that connection is one that, while the connection might not be for me there that's marrying into a family, because that family is a strong connection, one of the things we might think about is how it is that I'm going to have to develop a relationship with these people. Debbie's got a comment here. Debbie says, knowing the person you're thinking about marrying was raised by their family, so most of the time they're going to be like them. That's right. I remember years ago, a preacher was giving a lesson, and I was a young person in the audience, and he said to all of you who think about marriage, and it was on my mind at the time, he said, whenever you find the person, and I think he specifically said, whenever you find the girl that you're going to marry, he says, you need to meet her mother, because there's a lot of ways that she's going to be like her mother, and you need to see that and understand that that's what she has an expectation of, or that's what she has been raised in viewing. Now, that doesn't always mean that we're going to be like our parents. In fact, in a few weeks, we're going to talk about how some people very specifically decide not to be like their parents, for the better or for the worse. But the point is that in a generalistic way, Debbie's right, that does tend to be true. So that's something important to consider, that the person that I'm going to marry, that they're going to change as they get older, and maybe sometimes those changes could move towards being more like their family. And that's something important to consider. Another thing that we might consider is that oftentimes when my kids get a lot of lectures, and I feel bad for them in that sense, but I'll tell them that whenever they're, looking around, that they look at how marriage was impacted in that family home, that might be something worth considering too. That does this person understand what the commitments of marriage are like? Do they, and if they don't, is that something that they'd be willing to learn, that you could help them with? Or do they understand what the Bible expectations of marriage are? Because in this world today, there's a lot of people that don't grow up in homes where marriage is a central part of the family. And we would want to make sure that that people, when they marry, that they're marrying somebody who has some sense of that or can learn a sense of that. And you notice what I'm saying here is that maybe somebody didn't grow up in a home where marriage was the center of the family, and yet they might still wisely and accurately develop that concept. We'll talk about that in a few weeks as well. But the point is to appreciate and understand that, to see that ahead of time. Debbie makes a very practical point. She says family holidays, religion, money management can become problematic. It's interesting you say that, Debbie, because, it's a lot of times we marry somebody who is converted to Christ, but their family didn't convert. And so there can be maybe even strife over religion. In fact, I suspect a lot of people that are in this conversation right now, you know exactly what it is to have family strife over religion. And that sometimes is something that should be considered. Family holidays, how we spend time with each other. It needs to be understood that these are things that are important. When I married my wife, I understood that it wasn't fair for me to say, I'm just going to take you away from your family and you're just going to be with me from now on. And I expect you that you can't have any relationship with them anymore. I had to appreciate and understand that from a scriptural standpoint and from a practical one, just wasn't realistic or at all appropriate for me to consider. And that's an important thing for us to think about here. Hey, Lamar's got a good comment. Lamar says Lamar made a comment that I was kind of pointing to. The family may not be believers, which can challenge us to accept them while continually striving to convert them. Lamar, great comment. Because it would be inappropriate if we said something like, well, because they're not believers, we're just not going to have a relationship with them. That would be completely inappropriate. We understand we still have an obligation, even if family are not believers, we still are to fulfill those obligations that aren't just in the law of Christ, as I mentioned earlier. So Lamar, you're exactly right. We're still obligated to dwell with them in a peace, in a understanding way, while at the same time, you make the point to say we're striving to convert them. Perhaps that's by example, by word, by deed. Excellent point, Lamar. Rob makes another point. Rob says, the love of money is the root of many family issues. Rob, that's such a good point. I want to actually come back to that, okay? I want to come back to that because that's an important idea in the second question that I asked a second ago about family. Grant says, we have to be ready to treat their family as our own family, including taking on the difficulties that may come with that relationship. Exactly right, Grant. You understood the point I was making earlier to say that we have to look at a family and understand that when I am choosing the person I'm going to marry, I'm also choosing to take on whatever family difficulties come with that. Before Wendy and I got married, we met with the preacher who was going to perform or speak at the ceremony, I guess we just might say. And he did a little bit of marriage counseling. And one of the things he said is the thing you need to appreciate the most is all the luggage that you're going to take on this trip. And he says you each bring a lot of luggage that you have to carry for each other. And it was really a well-stated statement that really stuck with me. The idea that there's a lot of things, and family is a big part of that we bring in, that we're not allowed just to throw out because we don't want to carry that weight. Jacob gives us a good sense of that in his submission to Laban. And that's one of the important ideas that I think we need to consider is how Jacob behaved with Laban. He still behaved in that honorable way, even though we're going to say Laban, and this is the next point to come to here in just a moment, Laban did not. Laban did not. And that kind of brings me back to the second question. What problems arose in Jacob's relationship with Laban? I'm getting my people all mixed up here. With him and his sons. And Rob said something really important. Rob said earlier that it's the love of money that is a big part of the problem. And it should read Laban, that with Laban and his sons, that one of their big problems is that they and this family seems to be a family that's caught up with a love of money. And I think absolutely that's going to create a lot of the issues that are going to come up in this. And that, in fact, that just kind of brings us on to our next point, and let's just move to it. That is the second point that I wanted you to consider tonight. I wanted you to consider Laban, and there I have it again as Laban. It should be Laban. Laban I wonder if that was an autocorrect. Just didn't like Laban. That Laban, here he is. He's the brother of Rebekah, the father of Leah and Rachel. There's several times in the scriptures where we're told that he is not the most ethical of men. In fact, as we read about how it was that Jacob is talking to his wives about his family, we read there in Genesis chapter 31, he says in verse 5, he's talking about how his relationship with their father had deteriorated. He'd been serving him about 20 years. He says, in verse 6, he says, that with all my might I have served your father. That's the commendable thing for Jacob. Jacob has served his father-in-law dutifully and honorably. Yet your father has deceived me. And we know that from the very get-go, from the marriage, 7 years in, there was deception. That your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. And it's interesting for us to think about. Teresa says, that some of the problem here is they're envious of the herd that Jacob is able to make for himself. They kept changing his wages. And by the way, that seems to refer to the idea of the animals in the herd that they were going to allow Jacob to keep. And that every time it started to go well for Jacob, they'd switch it around. That's kind of how it sounds is going on, in verse 8, as he goes on to describe this, that he's constantly trying to undercut and cheat Jacob. And it seems to me that there's a good point to be said here about that love of money. Now, we go back to the statement here that we saw about this, and we see that the other thing that's mentioned here is that his own daughters talk about the problems that have been created there. His daughters go on to tell us there in verses 14 and 15, Rachel and Leah answered and said, this is Jacob they're talking to, is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he has sold us and also completely consumed our money. All these riches God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now, whatever God has said to you, do it. So you get a good sense here of the kind of man that Laban was. That Laban was a man that has an implicit greed. And what kind of things did that do? Well, his daughters are ready to go. They've had enough of him and they want him to leave, and Jacob wants to leave, and they want to take away, Laban will later say, these are my son, your children are my sons too, and his love for him. But his covetousness, his greed, well, you see how their reputation was before them. And I think it's important for us to understand that a lot of times families have very frank conversations with each other about the reputation of the family members. And there's an important point to consider here. Here is Laban, Here is Laban, and his greed damaged his reputation. It drove his family away. And I want us to consider that because I think this is very important. I think we need to understand that there's a great deal of damage that greed and covetousness does to the home. And that goes back to what Rob said, that the love of money is the root of many family issues. That for one thing, when greed and covetousness are in the home, it takes away from the natural affection that members of the family can have for one another. I'll tell you a great example of this. In the New Testament, Jesus is confronted by a man who says, hey, make my brother share the inheritance with me. Do you see how covetousness overwhelmed the familial relationship with them in discussing an inheritance? And that's a pretty common thing. When covetousness is in a family, it necessarily removes affection by the same amount or more, I guess we could say, that covetousness is present. And we need to understand that when covetousness and greed are present, it destroys the affection that people can have. And that's a really important thing for us to consider. So as we consider this point here, and we understand this, we understand too that Rachel and Leah, they're pretty bitter. And bitterness and resentment are natural results of a covetous home. And I would suggest that one of the problems here is that there was a complete misunderstanding of the priorities, that when people prioritize possessions in the home, in the family, that they will always forsake and fail their obligations. Debbie makes the point. She says, so often we see families fighting over inheritance. And you're exactly right, Debbie. And Jesus, whenever that fight came to him, do you remember what he said? He said, I have nothing to do with this. And maybe Jesus is saying, I have no interest in having anything to do with this. And that's an important point for us to consider as we talk about these things. I've got a couple of questions for you to think about here. Question number one is, what did God do for Jacob when Laban was mistreating him? Now, specifically, I want to kind of broaden this question for a second. Jacob served Laban honorably. We saw that back in chapter 31, and we read that just a second ago. Verse 6, he says, with all my might I've served your father. Jacob was an honorable son-in-law and served his father-in-law diligently, and Laban mistreated him. What did God do? We want to understand that the word of God, in fact, we read the verse in verse 7, the answer to that. What did God do? And why is this important for us to understand even today in the way that we live our lives now? Sandra's got a good point, by the way, kind of stepping back. Sandra says greed damages everything. You're right, Sandra. That actually would be a fantastic point to consider. Greed destroys everything. And it's almost as though we could say that the love of money, greed, is the root of all kinds of evil. So you're exactly right. It does. It just destroys everything. It corrupts the character to the degree that it cannot be virtuous. And I just can't think of anything worse than that. And here in this family, we see the family fall apart. We see the daughters and the son-in-law and the grandchildren all run away because of this problem that they have. What did God do about this, though? And why is that important for us to consider today? Well, I'll kind of help you out with this as we consider these things. Let's jump back to Genesis 31. Verse 7 says, here is Jacob. He says, your father deceived me, changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. There's number one. God did not allow him to hurt me. Let's go on reading and about this, because here is Teresa's comment. Teresa said he was blessed and God told him to leave. You know what's kind of interesting about that, Teresa? That God said it's time for you to go was Jacob's permission to go. And I kind of wonder about this one, that if Jacob was suffering all this time or struggling all this time, that he really wanted to go, but he didn't think it was honorable until God gave him permission. If so, that would really speak to Jacob's character and the changes of his character from the person that he was when he ran away or when he left home. But we go on reading here in verse 8, verse 9, so God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. So what's the point here? Number one, God didn't allow him to come to harm because of Laban's unfairness. Number two, God blessed Jacob with a great degree of wealth. And we want to consider that those are the things that are important for us to understand, that we want to see that that to this day, God says, hey, if you're in a difficult situation, I want you to serve me and honor me. I'll tell you what, actually consider this passage here in Matthew chapter 6, as Jesus was talking about doing charitable deeds. And he said in verse 3, when you do a charitable deed, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret. Your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. Now, I want you to consider the point here that the Word of God is saying that whenever we do things for God in service to God, that God then takes care of us. Here it is again in Colossians 3, verse 22, talking about us as employees. It says, obey in all things your masters, your employers, according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but sincerity of heart, fearing God. He goes on to say, whatever you do, do it heartily as though to the Lord, not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. Once again, here's the Word of God saying that when you do things the way God wants you to, God rewards you. Now, this is super important. This is an application principle that you're going to use every day. When you work for people, they're not always going to treat you right. Christians, we're told, are to serve people as though they're serving Christ, meaning that whether that person treats you right or wrong, you give them your very best, like Jacob did. And God says, I'll take care of you. And that's really important, because the world says, hey, if you don't watch out for number one, nobody else is going to watch out for you. In fact, the world would go so far as to say, if you let your boss take advantage of you, you deserve it. But the Word of God says to the Christian, you do what's right and you let me take care of it. This is God speaking. He'll take care of it. And he'll take care of it much better than you could ever imagine. Jacob became rich serving Laban. Now, we're not saying that we're going to become rich, but we're going to be blessed by God in serving God. God even, it's interesting, Teresa goes on to say, God even sometimes blesses those we work for because of us. And she says Joseph is the example of that. You're right. And Teresa, to this day, I believe that is true, that God blesses those that we're around, because the Bible says in places like Matthew chapter 5 that we're the salt of the earth. We're the preservative to the places we habitat, that we live, and that we work, and that we dwell. And so I believe absolutely that there are blessings on our community because we're here. And while the world may not always appreciate that, Potiphar certainly didn't appreciate that when he fired Joseph, that was where his blessings were at. And yet still, the point is God watched out for Joseph. This is important for us. Lamar goes on to say, many of us have this opportunity now to do our work as to the Lord as we work from home directives. Lamar, what I think you're even suggesting too is that here's an opportunity for a lot of people to say, hey, I'm slacking off, nobody's watching me, all these different things. And yet Lamar points out, here's an opportunity for us to demonstrate godliness by being ever so devoted to our work. We're working for the Lord. There's a terrible mistake that people say things like, well, this preacher is doing the Lord's work. No, every one of us is doing the Lord's work. The same way, we are working for the Lord in whatever we're doing, and that is the Lord's work. And it's important to understand every single Christian is employed in the service of the Lord, is doing the Lord's work. And you need to appreciate that idea. And Lamar said it well. Right now we have a better example than ever to consider this. Stan goes on to make the statement out of 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 33, bad company ruins good morals. To consider this idea of the bad examples that we can be in the world around us, that can certainly take away our influence before God. And we've got to be careful that we don't cease to be the light of the world, the salt of the earth. So those are all excellent questions for us to consider as we talk about these things. A couple other things we might think about as we consider these things. I'll tell you what, we're going to skip these two questions. I really would love you to consider them on your own. Why do people cheat family when they wouldn't cheat others? I think that one of the important things to consider is that we oftentimes we do things to family we wouldn't do to other people. I remember years ago a preacher, when I wanted to become a preacher, he said, Brian, one of the big mistakes preachers make is they feel like they're obligated or required to neglect their families in their work. And he says, never do that. And I've often considered that sometimes that is a thing that people do. They neglect their families because they believe their family is obligated to be neglected to whatever they're doing. And that was an important thing for us to consider. For the sake of time, we won't dwell on that too much. I got one more comment here from Anthony. Anthony says, we should always be working and doing our best because we are working for the Lord. Well said. Well said. Another point for us to consider is strife between brothers. That, of course, speaks to the brothers of Joseph and how it is that they do this terrible thing to him. And I would suggest to you that this is in large part a result of the favoritism that has come about. We're understanding that Joseph is the son of Jacob in his old age, but he's also the son of his preferred wife. And it's kind of important to consider that Benjamin too was a son in his old age, and that preference seems to fall with Benjamin as well. These are the sons of that preferred wife. Sometimes people have wondered about how the sons that were the sons of the servants of Zilpah and Bilhah, how they might have been treated in this relationship. And this is important for us to consider. I would say if we had the time to go into this, we would consider that Joseph perhaps wasn't always the most careful with the things that he said. That's an important lesson for us to consider. But I really want to come back and I want to consider some of the strife that's here. And I'll tell you what, we'll just consider these questions together and then move on to consider these things for the sake of time. The strife seems to have been rooted. The first question here, where was the strife rooted? And Teresa says part of the root of the problem was the jealousy among the wives and the mothers. Absolutely. That I would suggest to you that parents pass on their jealousies to their children. There's an important lesson to consider there, right, Teresa? That you've got to be careful about passing on your biases to your children. I've often said one of the worst thing any parent can do is to point out the flaws in their church family. Because those flaws, when pointed out by parents, are magnified by children. So that the flaws that might have been present in this spiritual family of Jacob between two sisters might have been magnified between their children to the degree that these things were brought about. Number one, great advice, never belittle or speak bad about your church family in front of the rest of your family. Because the things you say, because of the family dynamic of a magnification of our emotions or feelings, it makes it that much worse. I guarantee you speak badly about the church, you're guaranteeing those people that hear you won't follow you into that church family. That's an important point for us to consider. New Testament commandments designed to avoid strife. One of the ones you might consider is Matthew 18, where it says that if our brother sins against us, we are commanded by God to go to him and resolve this. Can you see how different this story might have been with Joseph and his brothers? If that had been the resolution of the bitterness between them all. But it wasn't. Unfortunately, instead, we know how it was that their hate was manifested. I wish we could spend a little more time talking about that manifestation. I'd want you to consider ideas like they didn't just take away Joseph's freedom, but they tormented Joseph's father by letting him think their son was dead. They took him away from his inheritance, his home, his brother, all the different things that he appreciated in life. What they did to him was one of the ugliest and most inhumane acts a person could do, to take away his identity. And I want you to think about how significant that is. They took away his identity as the member of the most blessed family on earth, and they utterly subjected him to the most deplorable circumstances there are, to be a slave and later to be a slave and a prisoner. What his family did to him, what his brothers did to him, was horrific. And you might say unforgivable, except that our last point is a point about forgiveness. And you guys have got great comments, and I'm sorry I'm not pulling them all in. Grant's got a good comment about Jacob's favoritism among his children. Certainly they can't stand him for that reason. They can't stand Joseph for that. Genesis 37 verse 4, Rob points out the jealousy that's provoked by their father's favoritism. You guys are right on. Even going back, I see a lot of good comments. Sandra had one, Stan had one. I'm sorry I'm moving too fast now just to kind of get to this last point. But this last point is super important. Joseph, when he's in a position now of the head of the most powerful country in the world, reveals himself to your brothers. He says, "Don't therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life." He kissed his brothers. He wept over them. After that, his brothers talked to him. This is, I'd say this is probably the best story in Genesis. There's lots of great stories in Genesis, but the story of Joseph forgiving his brothers is the best because I can't emphasize enough how awful what they did to him was. If they had murdered him, I think it would have been less pronounced than the fact that they took away everything of who he was. They stripped him of his identity and his worth and utterly cut him off and sent him to what might as well have been another world. And Joseph's first words to him are not just that he forgives them, but Joseph says, you guys need to forgive yourselves. Wow. I want you to think about that story for just a second, because when it comes to family, forgiveness is probably the most important lesson that we could walk away with tonight. I want you to think about, as I said, the nature of this wrong is so cataclysmic. But I also want you to think about the fact that perhaps no time except one other time had someone been in such a perfect position to take vengeance. Right? Joseph was now the most powerful man in the world, next to the Pharaoh, most powerful country in the world. He's the prime minister. And now he's the guy that holds all the cards. And like I said, I don't think, but with one exception, there was ever a time where there was this kind of opportunity to be considered here. And yet Joseph has such a love that the first thing that Joseph says is, you guys need to forgive yourselves. Not even, I forgive you. Because with Joseph, it was implied. You get that? What they had done to Joseph, imagine if, Joseph, his father, had died over this. I mean, he was, it ruined his life. Imagine all the different circumstances that there are here to consider. And Joseph's first statement isn't even, I forgive you. It's, you need to forgive yourselves. Because God blessed all of us. I'll say this. I really think that there's only one other place where that kind of love is found, right? You know what I'm thinking of, don't you? Somebody who was utterly cut off from their father because of the sins of those around them, and yet, when given the ultimate power, calls them his brother. Of course, we're talking about Christ. That the only time that a story like Joseph's would happen again is when Jesus would be betrayed and murdered. And yet when he comes into all power and all authority, he embraces, in fact, the very people that killed him. And he gives them the opportunity to be called his brethren. I tell you what, there's just no story like this. This is extraordinary. There's an ancient tradition, and this isn't in the Bible, by the way. But the Jews, when they looked in the rabbis talked about this a lot, that they talked about who the Messiah was going to be. And they saw in Isaiah 53 that there seemed to be two Messiahs, a victorious Messiah and a suffering Messiah. And they would always call the victorious Messiah the son of David. And that's even manifested in the New Testament. But the other thing they did that was so strange is that they would talk about the Messiah as the son of Joseph. Because he was one that suffered so greatly for the sake of others and had such love for them. And do you get it? Jesus isn't actually descended from Joseph, and yet Joseph is Christ in that profound foreshadowing moment. Teresa makes a comment. She says, I wonder if the brothers didn't feel too badly for lying to their father because of his favoritism. You do wonder what was going through their minds. In the midst of all of this, Judah's going to bury several of his sons. And I can't help but to think maybe that changed a lot of the way he thinks, because when the time comes, he's the one that, speaking to his brothers, says, we're getting everything we deserve because of what we did. Very interesting as we consider these things. A couple of questions I want us to consider here for just a moment. First of all, I'll tell you what, we won't consider this for the sake of time. We're actually at our time, and I really don't think it's very fair to say this, but here's the most important question. Why is it so hard to forgive family wounds? Why is it so hard to forgive family wounds? What do you think? You don't have time to answer it. I'm sorry. But you know what I'm talking about, right? If you think of the worst things that happen in your life, the things that make you the most bitter, typically, not always, typically, the root cause is family. Parents that didn't raise right. Kids that rebelled and broke our hearts. Siblings and inheritances and things like that. Things that just utterly wrecked us. I have to say that a big part of it, Teresa says it, they hurt the worst. The big point here to consider is that our family is a big part of our identity. When our family wrongs us, they're stealing our identity. When parents don't do right by their children, they're denying them their identity as children. When children rebel against their parents, they're denying them the honor due them as parents. Do you see what I meant when I said that Joseph's great wrong is that they robbed him of his person, of his identity? And when family wrongs us, that's a lot of why that wound is so painful. And whenever you're thinking about those things, you've got to go to Joseph. You got to think about Joseph, and you got to ask yourself the question, why was Joseph able to forgive his brothers? And you know the answer to that, right? The answer to that is that Joseph said, I can see God's hand in this. And whatever you did, God brought forth the blessing. Hey, if you're listening to this right now, I hope you're a child of God. Because if you are, then like Joseph, you can say that no matter what has happened in your life, God has brought you something good. If you're a child of God. I don't mean that bad things don't happen to children of God, but I mean that your inheritance, your reward, is far greater than all the wrongs that have ever been done to you. If you're not a child of God, I tell you what, I'd love to hear from you. You can contact me, visit with me. We want to talk about this. And as we wrap up our time, we're over our time, and I thank you so much for your patience and consideration on this. I want you to think about these questions that are raised in the family of Jacob and Joseph and his brothers, and how important it is that we consider what it is that family wounds can do for us. Consider family strife, covetousness, favoritism, the great damage that does. But consider more so just how important forgiveness is. And that's all the time that we have. I see a lot of people made some great comments. Rob's got a last good comment. Blood's thicker than water. That's why it hurts. You're right. Monique says the closeness of intimacy of family, the trust is broken, is violated. You're exactly right. Teresa reminds us, you look for that silver lining. If we're a child of God, it's not a silver lining. It's a silver core with just a cloudy lining. And we have to peer through that to find that core of great value that does everything. Rob reminds us our church family can create bonds that are broken. You know, that's something important that Jesus told Peter. He says, you lose your family in this world. He says, I'll give you back 100-fold right now. And he meant the church family. That can be a wonderful blessing. Thank you all for your time this week. And my prayers that you all have a great week. And you continue faithful and serving God and doing the things you need to do. Sorry I missed so many good comments. I see a lot of comments here I just didn't get to, and I'm sorry about that, but I really appreciate it. God bless you this week.